probably seen your super fund advertising free financial advice, but when could that cost you over 100 grand? Watch this one to find out. She's a beauty. Yeah, guys, Phil here from the Wealth Lab podcast, joined again by Dan. Welcome, Dan. How are you, mate?
Thank you, Phil. Back for round two. Cheers.
Back
Thanks
for
for
round
having
two. Yeah, nice to have you again, mate. Yeah, Scott's still away, so I think he'll be back next week, but got the pleasure of having Dan with us again. Got a bit of an interesting one today, and this was triggered off the back of a meeting I had with someone a couple of weeks ago. And it actually really got under my skin because the scenario annoyed me so badly that I wanted to jump on and do a podcast about it. Yeah, which is interesting. So I'm sure most of you out there, if you're with an industry super fund or something like that, you've probably seen them advertising free financial advice, so you can go and see one of their free financial advisors. And so I thought it might be worthwhile us actually talking through what actually is that, what does it mean, how does it work, and what are some of the traps to be aware of in accessing this free financial advice. And I know that was a bit of a clickbaity kind of title and a clickbaity intro, but in this case legitimately did cost these people probably north of 100 grand. So anyway, it's an interesting case that we'll talk through a bit later as we go. But Dan, maybe let's kick off with you, mate. So intra-fund financial advice, what is it?
Intra-fund advice is a type of advice that super funds offer to their clients, essentially. It is supposed to help them pick between investment options, making contributions, or choosing insurance within their fund, and it is usually free.
I might just pick up on that free for a minute.
Yeah, I thought you might.
Which is an interesting one. And probably before I get too far into this as well, I want to be really, really clear here that I am not bashing intra-fund advice. I think there's definitely a place for intra-fund advice, and it is absolutely appropriate in a number of circumstances. And I'm also not bashing intra-fund advisors. I've worked for super funds in the past. I know a lot of people that are very qualified, very skilled financial advisors that for whatever reason work in that space. So, I'm not bashing them, but there is absolutely times when it is not going to be an appropriate solution for you, and you need to be aware of that and think it through. So I'll be clear with that, but I'm going to pick up on this thing of free financial advice. There are no free lunches in the world. We all know that. Financial advice is actually a bloody expensive business to be in. By the time you pay all your government levies and your compensation schemes and advisor registrations and professional indemnity insurance and compliance and all this sort of stuff, it's actually a very expensive business. And big super funds that offer financial advice carry all those same costs. So obviously providing financial advice comes at a cost. Despite the fact they may advertise it as being free advice, it's not free advice. You are paying for the advice that any member gets from that super fund through your admin fees. So you're still carrying part of the cost. And, if you leverage it, great. I've worked for some big funds in the past, and I think some of the stats I heard thrown around were that about 2% of the member base used the service, but 98% of the member base were carrying the cost for it. So, it's not free, but it's a service that is provided as part of the admin fees that you're paying to the fund. But it does get, it comes with a range of restrictions. So the laws around financial planning for a fund to be able to provide intra-fund advice mean that it's very specific in the scope that it can sort of offer. Dan, you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, that's right. It's limited to the areas I spoke about before. So the contributions, investment options, and the insurance within the fund. It can't cover tax strategies, estate planning, investment options outside of super or anything like that. So it's specifically what is held inside that fund. Almost to even the restriction of your partner's super fund. So if your partner is with a different super fund, they can't even give advice around that, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, and this is probably one of my bugbears with the legislation. So not what the funds are doing, not what the advisors are doing, but actually the legislation that binds them to what they're able to do. Because if we think about, everyone's aware of the Royal Commission into Financial Planning and Banking and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things that came out of that was a code of ethics that we all have to operate under. And a lot of it's just common sense. Like any person that's a reasonable human being that actually cares about other human beings would be doing this stuff anyway, but it's legislated and it's in a code of ethics. So, but one of the things that the legislation says in the Corporations Act is, as an advisor, we must provide advice that's in the best interest of our members or of our clients. And then the code of ethics kind of takes that a step further and says we've got to consider your broader circumstances. So even if it's just you that's come to me for advice on a specific thing, I actually I have a legal obligation to consider what else is going on in your family, surrounding that, your tax position, your stuff in the bank, whatever else is going on in your world that may impact that advice I'm giving you. I need to consider that as part of the advice as well. And that's a legislative requirement. So even if you're not looking for advice on that stuff, we still need to think about it, because realistically, you're seeing an advisor because you don't know what you don't know. So it's our job to point this stuff out. And this probably brings me to the point of like where IntraFund can really be an appropriate solution for people. Like, Dan, what are some reasons you reckon IntraFund advice could be a good fit for someone?
If I was young, opening up an account, and I don't know what the investment options are, what investment options suits me, whether I should take up, I think you're automatically put into insurance when you open up one of these super funds. Should I have that insurance? How much insurance? All of those kind of things, I think are good reasons to, seek that kind of advice.
Could be a really good fit. Yeah, you just need some really basic salary sacrifice advice, basic insurance advice, basic investment advice. There's probably no real need for you to go and spend a ton of money on engaging a financial planner for that kind of simple area. Where I get really concerned, though, is when people start getting intra-fund financial advice on their retirement planning. And again, there might be some circumstances where that's fine. Maybe you've got nothing else, you're single, you've just got that fund and there's nothing else. And okay, maybe that's okay. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But certainly where there's investments involved, money in the bank account involved, you're a member of a couple and you've got a spouse and all that sort of stuff, in my view, it becomes very, very difficult for an advisor to be able to provide advice that only considers your interest in that superannuation fund and doesn't consider all this stuff that's going on. This particular example that prompted me to want to do this episode is, honestly, it's a glaring example of where there's some problems here. So I might jump in and run through the case study and just show you what I'm talking about. And, welcome back to my ugly spreadsheet from last week that I've butchered a bit to be useful for this week as well.
Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. Real quick, I've got Jordan, our client liaison manager. He's the one that's going to speak to you if you've got any questions in relation to your financial planning, your superannuation, or just what Wealth Lab helps people with. Book a meeting in the comments below. You'll be able to go straight into his diary. Or if you want to know more, you'll be able to speak to Jordan right here. All right, back to the video.
Here's my spreadsheet again. The scenario we've got here is the couple I saw, they're a couple, wife was 67 and the husband was 60. So we had a 7-year age gap, but the husband had retired first. So he was already retired. She was getting ready to retire. 67 is the age pension age. So she was eligible, like her age, she was eligible for the age pension. The husband's not eligible for another 7 years. In terms of assets that they had, they had a car and a caravan. They're about to head off traveling. Not a lot of contents. They'd sort of sold everything off as they were getting ready to go. The house was worth about $1 million. The husband had $400,000 in super that had been moved to an account-based pension, and that's important for reasons I'll point out in a minute. The wife's got about $200,000 in super, and I've just done a typo here, but they had $500,000 in the bank. They'd sold a property recently and had some cash left over from that. So in that scenario, when I look at that, the way things are structured right now, despite the fact that the wife is 67 and eligible for the age pension, she's not going to get any because, if you're watching last week, it's $1,074,000, there it is the cutoff to be eligible for the age pension in assessable assets. So the way they got structured right now is 1.28 mil in assessable assets. So they're cut off. There's no pension. And straight away when I looked at this, I thought, cool, this is a scenario where I can help these clients actually and get them some pension, which is going to be a nice win. Because I thought, there's some simple restructuring we can do here to hold assets in the right place to help for Centrelink assessment. So I talked through some of these options with the clients. They were very excited and then pointed out to me that, my husband, he's already seen an advisory super fund and they've already done the pension bit for us. So you don't need to worry about that. I said, okay, cool. That's good. We might want to make some changes there, but let's talk more about that. And they went on further to explain that the advisor had recommended that when he retired, he pulled all of his super out, he put it into their bank account, and then he put it back into super. When I say all of it, predominantly, like a good chunk of it, 360,000 came out and went back in, and then an account-based pension for 400,000 was commenced. And straight away, I knew we had a big problem. If you look at that piece of advice by itself, just considering the husband as the intra-fund advisor would have done, because that's what they're legislated to do, maybe that makes sense. If you've watched some previous episodes and we've talked about, tax on estate planning and that sort of stuff, we have spoken about sometimes you may consider pulling some money out of super and putting it back in to provide better estate planning outcomes if adult children are going to inherit your money. So the intra-fund advisor had addressed that. By taking the money out, putting it back in, they've saved, a decent chunk of potential estate tax. Only if the husband predeceases, or only if the husband and the wife kind of go at the same time and there's money left when the kids inherit it and a whole bunch of ifs, whens, buts, maybes. So maybe there was an argument as a standalone piece of advice that made sense. But when you consider their broader circumstances and them as a couple, makes no bloody sense whatsoever. Dan, what issues can you see there?
Well, the money's going to account-based pension mode, right? So then it's accessible for Centrelink on her age pension.
Yeah, good start. Good start. So one thing to be aware of is when you retire, and this is where it's kind of handy if you've got a younger spouse, but if you've got a couple and one member of the couple's pension age and the other isn't, any money that is held in accumulation phase of your superannuation is not accessible for Centrelink purposes. So straight away, by putting that money into an account-based pension, they've taken this $400,000 that was not an assessable asset and they've made it an assessable asset. And so that's wiped them out of the pension eligibility straight away. So that's at least, okay, that's annoying. It's a bit more paperwork and a bit of stuffing around, but that's a problem we can solve. It wasn't great advice, but we can fix it pretty easily by very simply closing that account-based pension and putting the money back into accumulation. Now, ignore my brackets over here where I've been too lazy to actually write the right formulas. Wherever we've got a bracket means, just imagine that says zero age pension. So they're getting zero age pension at the moment. If we very simply take that step of rolling this 400,000 out of the pension, out of the account-based pension, putting it back into accumulation, that disappears from assessment. So now in that circumstance, the wife will be eligible for about $291 a fortnight in age pension. So that very simple step, puts them about $7,500 a year better off, or about $52,000, nearly $53,000 a year better off over the next 7 years. That's a pretty substantial difference for a very small tweak. So in that scenario, I'll look at it and go, yeah, okay, the advice wasn't great, but it's not that hard to unwind. We can kind of fix that. Here's where the problem comes in that we can't unwind. The advisor that had done that advice had done this estate planning strategy. So they had prioritised maybe a potential inheritees paying slightly less tax in God knows when over the client's immediate here and now. In my view, you should never approach retirement planning that way. The retirement planning should be about you first and whoever's going to inherit your money second. And yet, cool strategy, great thing to do, but only if it's appropriate and when it's appropriate.
It sounds really cool when you present that advice too, right? Like you present, if somebody inherits your super, they'll pay way less tax on it. It sounds really cool when you present that kind of advice.
It does, yeah.
It does. Like cool. As a client, you're like, oh, sweet, that's good for my kids or whoever's going to inherit this money. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Good story to tell. And like I say, not a bad strategy. Yeah. It makes sense. But in this case, very, very costly to the clients because we've still got the issue of this $500,000 sitting in the bank account. And that $500,000 sitting there in the bank account is an assessable asset. So immediately when I look at that, I think, well, why are we holding that $500,000 in the bank account? Why haven't we put that into the husband's accumulation fund where it's no longer an assessable asset? And we've got contribution caps, so you'd be familiar with those if you've listened to the past. We can put $120,000 per year, or we can use the bring forward rule, which lets us do 3 years, so it brings it up to $360,000. That's what the other advisor had used to pull this money out of super and put it back in again to get rid of this estate tax problem. What would have been a much, much better use of that cap and those limits would be actually be a bit smarter. Let's do $120,000 this year and another $360,000 in July and drop this $500,000 in, or $480,000 out of this $500,000. So now we've got another $480,000 that has disappeared from Centrelink's assessment, leaving $20,000 in the bank as an assessable asset. Have a look at what this does to the age pension. Bang. Now she's eligible for the full pension. So she's getting $23,000 a year. Over the 7-year period, that is $160,000 better off than the advice they got from the industry fund advisor, the intra-fund advisor. What do you reckon, Dan?
Yeah.
Is that a bit of a misstep?
Yeah. It's crazy because you can't even reverse it too, because if he takes that money out of super, it's accessible straight away. We can't get it back into accumulation. It's just...
Yeah, it's done. Yeah, it's a mess.
Done. Yep.
So, there's an example of free financial advice. We could unwind about $50,000 of that problem, but that's still $110,000 worse off for getting advice that didn't consider your full circumstances and only looked at a very narrow view. So I reckon that's a doozy, mate. That's probably one of the worst. Like, I've seen a lot of examples of fairly crappy intra-fund advice over the years, but that's probably one of the worst I've seen. What do you think the advisor should have done?
Yeah, I mean, the piece of advice itself makes sense. Like, if you saw that statement of advice and never considered these other things that are going on, it's fine. Like, you see that kind of advice all the time. And it makes sense. And as I said, it's really nice to present to the client because whoever inherits that super is not going to pay less tax. So it seems great.
Sounds great. Till you realise it cost you $110,000.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
That one was a doozy. And look, it is probably an extreme case, but it is the type of things that happen all the time. We've seen similar things with total and permanent disability payouts where, withdrawals have been recommended without actually really understanding the tax position properly. And we've seen clients pay $20,000-$30,000 tax on withdrawals when they probably only needed to pay 8 or 9. That's another sort of common one. So there's a lot going on there. But look, in my view, what should have happened there is that advisor should have said, look, I know you're married. I know your partner's retiring. I don't know you know, what else is going on in your world. But because I'm only legally allowed to give you advice on your interest in this fund, I can't meet my best interest duty, and I can't consider your broader circumstances. So actually, I can't give you this advice. You need to seek comprehensive financial advice. That's what should have happened in that scenario.
Yeah.
And look, like I say, I've worked for these funds. I know what the targets are like. I know you need to write a certain number of pieces of advice every year and all those sort of things. So maybe that skews how people think. I don't know. Don't know what happened in this case, or whether there just weren't enough questions asked. But seriously shitty outcome. I think we can all agree.
I mean, the comprehensive advice would have paid for itself instantly, right? Like $160,000. It's insane
Straight
outcome.
up, huge.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I'm aware this has probably come across as a bit of a intra-fund advice bash. Absolutely not the case. There are times when it is completely appropriate, but I would say in 99% of cases, retirement planning is not one of those times. You cannot give appropriate retirement planning advice without considering everything that's going on in your world. You can't just look at your super fund and go, do this thing and you're fine. It's nuts to even consider as being a reasonable thing. And I honestly can't believe the government, legislation has allowed it, but here we are. So anyway, not saying don't use your intra-fund advisor, don't take free financial advice. Just be really aware of the limitations and make sure that it is appropriate for what you're looking for and where you're at in life. And like Dan was talking about earlier, if it's simple insurance advice, contributions, whatever, sure, go nuts, probably makes sense. But some of those bigger decisions might be better left to full comprehensive advice that, is going to consider your entire needs. Yeah, it's probably enough of a rant from me. I've been talking for a long time, Dan.
You're very passionate about this topic. Said you're very passionate about this topic, you can tell, definitely.
Well,
But
just when people come to an advisor, they're trusting a professional and you don't know what you don't know. So you should be able to trust that professional is doing the right job, which in this case, is very debatable.
I'd like to think it goes the other way too. If you come to see a comprehensive advisor, if you came to see us and we think you could get value, if it's too basic or you're just trying to get an investment option inside your super fund or something like that, I think we would direct you towards that kind of advice inside your super fund, right? Like if we think it's below the scope of financial advice, as you said, it's expensive. If we think it's below that scope, we will direct you that way.
Yeah, I had that exact case yesterday afternoon. I had that conversation with someone that came in. They said, "I've done all of this. Do I need to speak to you?" And realistically, I mean, sure you can, but you're gonna pay me money, and I'm going to tell you to do what you've already done. So there are appropriate cases where we will decline to give advice because it's not in your best interest and it's not worth spending the money. And it should work both ways. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But look, not saying one's necessarily better than the other. Just be very aware of the limitations of what you're getting and make sure it all makes sense. Is probably the wrap up there.
Yeah. Time and place for both, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Anyway, that's my rant for this week. It's got to be back with us next week, so we'll wrap up now and get the next one out. But look, as we always say, if there's anything you'd like to see us speak about or any questions you'd like us to tackle or do an episode on, hit us in the comments, and we'll put something together. Thanks for having me, Phil. Been good to chat again. Yeah, no worries, mate. Nice to have a different face to talk to for a bit. You missed Scott. Don't lie. All right, beautiful. That's us for another week. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Cheers, guys.